Well, it's good morning and it's good evening for me. Tommy Serafinski, thanks for joining us here at Yellow Shelf.
Thank you, Joanne, for the invitation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, super excited to hear about your podcast, Conservation and Science. I have been listening for a while, Tommy. I'm one of those honest people who, I don't know a lot, and I guess I turned to your podcast to really become educated. I was curious about, science, conservation, the narrative that you hear and you read, and yeah, I was not super informed, so I've really enjoyed learning about so much. But I'm going to
Thank
hand over
you.
to you. Tell us, what do we need to know about your podcast?
Well, I think you mentioned name conservation and science, and like my tagline is that we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, but human wildlife interactions. That's the one that I like the most because it's all encompassing. It is conservation, it is scientific research, it is, problem animals, human wildlife conflict, it is hunting and fishing. So it covers all the aspects where we humans and our civilizations are coming in contact with animals and animal world. So, and I think another important thing about my podcast is that I always try to give many perspectives on any issue, because especially these days the conversation seems to be quite polarized. And like, I'm not even talking about politics and conservation. That was the case for years.
Yeah.
And as some people say, conservation is 90% conflict management, and it's probably 90% social sciences,
Yeah.
while ecology and biology is probably 10-15% of all that. So sometimes I feel like with every episode, half of my audience is upset.
Okay.
Maybe it's not that bad, but like, I am not backing away to
Yeah.
talk with people who even I disagree with them, or I think I'm gonna disagree with them. And then once I start talking with them, there's like, oh, they actually have a good point from the
Yeah.
perspective where they are and where they are. So I think this is my mission. I always say, like, if after listening to one of my episodes, someone says like, "Hey, I never thought about that," then
Yeah.
my mission is done. That's what I'm doing this for.
Yeah. And look, you've been at this for like 5 years. You've got nearly 200 episodes up. You do that so well as the host. You really do introduce all sorts of guests, whether they're, world experts or farmers. So you've got this really diverse range of topics and guests, and you really do that well. You're really considered in your approach in the conversations. Tommy,
Thank
I'm
you.
curious to know. Um, what inspired you to create this podcast? What do we need to know about you, Tommy? What's your background?
Ah, yes. So, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not Irish. I was born in Poland. I'm Polish. I moved to Ireland almost 20 years ago at this point. And how it started is like, I had a blog which was like, it was called, Tommy's Fishing Adventures, or, like a Polish version of it. And as I moved to Ireland and I was still writing this blog, I thought about making content in English, because as my social circles
Yeah.
become English speaking and I was immersed in the English speaking society, I thought it would be cool to do some content, to create some content for English speakers in English. And obviously, writing in the foreign language is more difficult than speaking, so the podcast was a natural fit. And I started doing podcast, and the original title of the podcast was Tommy's Outdoors, because the idea was that I'm going to be talking with people I meet while I'm outdoors doing outdoorsy
Ah,
stuff. And I think that the pivotal moment was when we had this discussion about tagging fish, when anglers are catching fish and they're tagging fish, and some people were saying like, oh, it's bad for fish and whatever, and the other was saying like, no, it's good because they're providing scientific data and so on. And as always, right, I wanted to dig into this.
yeah.
And so I contacted one of the scientific projects that were doing fish tagging and other stuff. And hey, would you like to talk to me on a podcast? And they agreed. And shortly after, the project manager contacted me and said like, hey, we actually have a lot of going on, would you like to do a series of episodes with our scientists? And I said like, yeah, sure. And as we were doing that, other scientific projects starts contacting me. It's like, hey, we heard that you're doing that with the other one. Would you do that with us as well?
Yeah.
And in parallel, there was like a very positive
Mm.
feedback from my audience. It was like, well, you're really talking about experts about the stuff that we are curious about.
Yeah.
And so over time, I thought like, it's not Tommy's Outdoors. It's neither about Tommy's nor about outdoors. And that's why I changed the title of the podcast to Conservation and Science, because that reflects more what I do. And again, it's not only discussion with the scientists, it is also discussions, like you said, with farmers, with policymakers, with people who are lobbying on the political level for nature conservation, etc., etc. So that's how conservation and science came to be.
Yeah. And and that's super interesting, isn't it? The evolution of podcasting. You just evolve as the host because yeah, the show evolves as well. Tommy, how do we connect with you? If we're watching now, we're curious. I'll put this in the show notes. How do we, where do we find you, Tommy?
Well, the best way to find me is on the very app you are using right now to listen to this podcast. Once you stop listening to this podcast, hit the search button and type conservation and science, and you'll find me there. That's
Yeah.
the best way.
Yeah. Well, look, I'll put that in the show notes to make it super easy. Tommy,
Mhm.
thanks for joining us. I feel like you've just made me a better, interesting human. Your podcast probably inspires conversations that I have elsewhere that, yeah, maybe I didn't know much about, but I've learned a lot and I continue to learn a lot. So keep podcasting, Tommy. You've got some really great topics and guests, no doubt, coming up.
Joanne, thank you so much. And folks, I'll listen to that. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
yeah, no worries. Thanks, Tommy.